Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Academic Freedom Symposium. I think most people have arrived by now. A lot of them had trouble finding parking space, I heard. So thank you very much for being here on this sunny Saturday afternoon. We've structured today's event into 2-hour-long sessions, followed by a coffee break, and then another session, a panel discussion, and finally a reception. And restrooms facilities are located nearby, like you saw maybe. Today's symposium is organized by Hypatia. We are an organization committed to promote academic freedom and freedom of speech on campus. We are comprised of academics who share a deep dedication to these principles. Our origins trace back to 2022, following a petition that we had organized and that maybe some of you may recall. What had happened? In June 2022, 2 employees of the University of Antwerp were suspended for several months because in a private conversation that was accidentally recorded and illegally posted on social media, they made some perceived racist remarks. So we organized a petition which had almost 5,000 signatures in favor of these 2 employees. You can read more about that incident on our website. This incident was actually illustrative for a much more fundamental problem, namely a waning freedom of speech at the universities and a waning academic freedom. So we thought action on a more structural basis was needed, and therefore we founded Hypatia. What do we do as Hypatia? We are writing articles about issues on academic freedom. We try to mediate when there are conflicts, and today we are organizing our first event, a symposium. Before we start, however, I wish to address some potential concerns. The first one is the diversity of perspectives represented in our panel. While we have made efforts to ensure a wide range of viewpoints, there is always room for improvement in this regard. It is our belief that robust discourse thrives on diverse perspectives. We do not want to become an echo chamber. Unfortunately, it was very difficult to attract speakers with opinions that differed from our own opinions in these matters. A lot of them, unfortunately, did not even reply to our invitation. And I think that touches the heart of the problem. Academia was and should be a place of openness, of free discussion. But unfortunately, we see that today, a large part of academia has lost this willingness to exchange views. And that brings me to a second potential concern I want to address. Woke, you know the word, I guess. The members of Hypatia think woke is a serious threat to academic freedom. Some of you may think, yes, but maybe that's a problem in the United States, but not here in Belgium, because here are hardly any examples of people who are fired because they said the wrong things. But that is not really how woke and more specifically cancel culture works. It is a much more subtle mechanism that includes certain forms of censorship and self-censorship, mild intimidation, marginalization, and so on. It is often not easy to pinpoint, and that makes it even more dangerous. A last potential concern I want to address is that woke does not exist, because it has not a clear definition. First of all, it is not true that woke has no clear definition. There are a lot of definitions about woke. I will give you 2. The first one, woke is the ideology that holds that all our thoughts and communications harbor power and patterns of oppression associated with skin color, race, and lived experiences. Another one, woke is the ideology of insincere fabrication of victims and victimhood through manufactured oppression/discrimination for the ultimate purpose of acquiring power through such victimhood and attaining undeserved social standing through folks' outrage and virtue signaling. What is true is that there does not exist one single definition about woke, but that is not a problem. There also does not exist one single definition about racism, and nobody will say racism does not exist. Neither does there exist one definition of species in biology, but it is a concept biologists use on a daily basis. To conclude, I want to say that we hope it will be possible to reintroduce the former culture of debate at the universities, so that the universities can again focus on their most important task, truth-seeking. Before we start, I also want to say that the keynote speakers will sell some of their books during the reception at the end. But we also have a special guest today, and that is Nadia Geerts. She's completely in the back. Maybe, Nadia, you can stand 1 second. Okay. Nadia is not giving a presentation today, but she's also a specialist in the field of woke. She's a philosopher from the Free University of Brussels, and she's also a feminist fighting for secularism, anti-racist and anti-wokeist. She recently published her book, Woke, en français, in French, Woke, la tyrannie victimaire. But unfortunately, Nadia cannot stay until the end today, so therefore she will sell some of her books during the coffee break. So the coffee break will be over there, and Nadia will sell there some of her books, and feel free then to have a chat with her. And I'm now pleased to introduce our chair for today's session, Philip Bukens. Philip Bukens teaches logic and argumentation at the Faculty of Law at Leuven University, the KU Leuven, and analytical philosophy at the Higher Institute of Philosophy, also in Leuven, and Tilburg University in the Netherlands. He has authored 10 books on topics related to philosophy of language and critical thinking/reasoning, currently emphasizing applications of game theory in communication theory and argumentation theory. He was a columnist for Philosophie magazine, a Dutch magazine, for a while, and occasionally he publishes opinion pieces. Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Proceed to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Nathalie. Professor Emeritus Nathalie Heilig from, she's originally a sociologist, published widely on the history of arts, and we invited her because she published a very interesting book in 2020 called Le Wokisme, so that's the way to put it in French, I guess, Le Wokisme. Le Wokisme serait-il un totalitarisme, published in 2023. I'm going to give her the floor, and we will immediately continue thereafter with a discussion of her paper by Professor Paul Tuteur from Leiden University, and about whom I will say a bit more after the talk of Nathalie. Nathalie, you have the floor. Questions can be asked in English or in Dutch, and we will discuss whatever, we will discuss them in whatever language is appropriate.
Not in Dutch.
Okay, Nathalie.
Just try it.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Steve and all the organizers.
I think the microphone.
Oh, it works in green. In France, it's red. So many thanks to Astrid and all the organizers. Very happy to be here today in this wonderful building. And I will start with an example linked to recent events which illustrates the misunderstandings committed against the notion of academic freedom. I will then highlight the errors in reasoning that allow these misunderstandings to occur. And finally, I'll attempt to define academic freedom in the negative on the basis of what it is not. And so, in October 2023, that is 4 months ago, an appeal entitled Defending Freedom of Expression on Palestine, an Academic Issue, was launched in France. Of course, it was in French, but I translated it to English. Drafted by, I quote, researchers, jurists, anthropologists, sociologists, historians, geographers, economists, political scientists, specialists in Middle Eastern societies and the Arab worlds, as well as our colleagues in higher education and research in solidarity, unquote. It was signed by around 1,000 people, and I should point out that the wording is in inclusive writing, écriture inclusive, which today in France signals a militant commitment to the DEI program, diversity, equality, inclusion. So, in short, to wokeism. So the text denounces, I quote, intimidation manifested in the cancellation of scientific events as well as hindrances to the expression of free academic thought. We are seeing an increasing number of messages sent by the management of universities, research laboratories, the CNRS, National Center for Scientific Research, and by the Ministry of Higher Education and Research itself, inviting researchers and teachers to report the expression of ideas deemed to be out of line, unquote. This situation, quote, may have led to self-censorship among researchers, hindering our intellectual reflection and calling into question our professional ethics at a time when these are all the more crucial, unquote. It is also asserted in the text that, quote, free research, which is a guarantee of the proper democratic functioning of a society, aims to inform and illuminate realities by means of historical, geographical, anthropological, sociological, economic, legal, and political analytical tools. These tools enable us to produce knowledge and critical, plural views of the world. Our ethics as researchers are based on the right to expose our work and analyses without misappropriation, interruption, or prejudice. That's why we call on our supervisory bodies to ensure that intimidation, defamation, and restrictions on scientific speech cease, and that our colleagues can be protected in their mission to disseminate scientific knowledge, unquote. Here's a text that seems to illustrate perfectly a legitimate demand for protection of academic freedom. I'm sure we could all sign it. In a situation where it would be threatened, this academic freedom, it would be threatened by pressures from outside the scientific world, religious, political, or economic pressures. Who among us would not sign such a text? But on closer inspection, things are far less clear-cut. The context of the appeal, and the context is, quote, the serious acts of censorship and repression we have witnessed in the French public arena since the dramatic events of October 7, unquote. This context sheds light on what prompted it. Positions taken by a student union and supported by teachers in favor of Hamas, denying the terrorist nature of the attack and considering it as an act of resistance to Israel. These positions were condemned by university officials as apology for terrorism and guilty of anti-Semitism, both punishable in France by criminal prosecution. And their authors were threatened with sanctions. As the authors of the appeal acknowledge, quote, serious accusations of anti-Semitism or apology for terrorism have already been made against certain specialist colleagues in the region, unquote. It should be noted that the authors of the appeal do not deny having advocated terrorism or having made anti-Semitic remarks. They protest against the fact that they could be accused of doing so. The first question that arises at this stage is this: do university officials have the right to sanction colleagues whose behavior or remarks fall foul of the law? Let me make it clear that sanctions come from within the academic world and not from outside authorities, political or judicial. There is therefore no infringement of academic freedom in the strict sense, but rather internal regulation by the academic world. This is the first argumentative twist in the appeal. It confuses external control with internal regulation. The second observation: the text denounces, quote, the police of thought that have taken hold in the French academic world for several years, following on from the invention of Islamoleftism to disqualify certain scientific discourse, unquote. Islamogauchisme is the term which is now very much used to speak about the extreme left, which takes stances in favor of Islamism. So this part of the text is referring to a polemic launched after the murder of teacher Samuel Paty by an Islamist in 2020, which had led to the Minister of Education denouncing the Islamogauchism reigning at the university. What's striking about this sentence is the word scientific discourse. Indeed, it seems to take it for granted that the meetings and newspaper editorials held after October 7 are part of scientific discourse, which leaves one wondering about the quality and status of such discourse itself. How can scientific discourse be developed in the space of a few days on the subject of such a complex event, so charged with emotion and values? Moreover, in the same paragraph, the text contrasts these scientific discourses with the, quote, tribunes, articles and communiqués, tribune, articles et communiqués, of non-specialist colleagues, denouncing the difference in treatment since they were able to express themselves without any real contradiction. Here then is a second argumentative twist. The appeal confuses discourse in the sense of the expression of opinions with discourse in the sense of texts pertaining to scientific work. And in doing so, it claims to confer on political opinions the academic protection accorded to scientific work, provided they are expressed in the university arena or by academics. There is thus confusion between, on the one hand, the place of publication and the status of the authors of the speeches, academia, and on the other hand, the nature of the incriminated speeches, political opinions. The second argumentative twist, therefore, that overlooks the specificity of science in relation to opinion, and thus the very principle that justifies the existence of the academic world. The appeal also asserts, quote, that the disturbing dynamics we observe within the academic sphere reflect a broader structural phenomenon of repression of non-hegemonic speech and expression of non-hegemonic thought, unquote. Here again, the term non-hegemonic betrays a misunderstanding of the logic of the scientific world, which is bound to control what happens in it not according to whether it is hegemonic or non-hegemonic, a property more properly belonging to the political world, but according to whether it respects the validity procedures proper to science. Once again, there is a confusion between the academic and political worlds based on a profound misunderstanding of the rules governing the production of scientific knowledge. Here's another highly revealing assertion of this confusion. Quote, censors have an ideological bias that they impose without care, refusing the intellectual exchange which is at the heart of our practices, unquote. First of all, the term censorship has no meaning in the scientific world, which is governed by peer control and not by external authorities, as in the case of censorship, and according to criteria that are not ideological, but methodological, conceptual, argumentative, logical, and so on. The very use of the term censorship demonstrates once again the ignorance of the rules specific to the academic world on the part of the authors of this appeal, who are teachers in the academia. Moreover, accusing their opponents of ideological bias is a typical example of accusatory inversion. Accused of defending an ideology that falls foul of the law, academic activists, as I call them, académo-militants in small a pamphlet I published 2 years ago, academic activists defend themselves by accusing their accusers of being ideologists. And as for intellectual exchange as an academic standard to be defended, one wonders what place it has in political rallies designed to unite activists around a cause. Here again, the argument takes refuge behind the protections attributed to scientific work to claim them in the case of political positions, be they expressed by researchers specialized in the geographical area concerned. The authors of the appeal ignore the fact that the status of a discourse is dictated not only by the status of the speaker, but also by the context of enunciation and, above all, the chance in which it operates. Quite logically, the appeal calls for, quote, the free expression of our words, analysis and political positions against the climate of threat that engenders fear and self-censorship, unquote. Yet another denial of the specificity of knowledge, whose production is the opposite of free expression of political opinions, since it exists only under the control of peers, thus the furthest thing from free expression, and is based on the requirement of axiological neutrality of the researcher. This is made even clearer at the very end of the appeal. Quote, we also wish to reaffirm our right to support causes and express our solidarity as individuals like any other citizen, unquote. In other words, the appeal demands that researchers have the same right to freedom of expression as any citizen, while at the same time demanding that in the name of academic freedom, they should not be subject to the same freedom regulations to which citizens are subject. This is what is commonly known as having your cake and eating it too, avoir le beurre et l'argent du beurre en français, the cake of a citizen's freedom of expression and the cake of academic freedom, both confused as if in the exercise of their functions as teachers and researchers, they were expressing themselves as citizens. In other words, they deny the specificity of academic status when it risks constraining them, while claiming it when it suits them. So now a few confusions about academic freedom. The invocation of academic freedom in favor of militant causes or activist causes betrays several confusions. The first confusion is what I used to call the confusion of arenas, la confusion des arènes, between the scientific arena of knowledge production and the civic arena of the expression of political opinions. Both arenas have their legitimacy, provided they are clearly distinguished. Both have the scientific arena resides in specialized journals, colloquia, and academic works, as here today. The political arena resides in the press, social networks, and in some cases, the streets where demonstrations are organized or where posters are stuck. The difference is clear if we take into account the contexts and material supports in which ideas are published or expressed, and this taking into account is, of course, part of the sociological agenda. This confusion of arenas also leads to a disregard or contempt for the researcher's imperative of neutrality, without which there can be no objective knowledge. This disregard for neutrality is based on the vague use of the words ideas or discourse, which confuse the scientific concept with the expression of opinions. What's more, confusing arenas automatically confuses academic freedom, which is specific to the scientific arena, with freedom of expression, which is specific to the civic arena and concerns all citizens. Academic freedom is the right to produce knowledge without any control outside peer review. This means that academic freedom can only be claimed on condition of acceptance of peer control, which is the opposite of absolute freedom. Paradoxically, academic freedom requires submission to production constraints that are far more stringent than those imposed on the expression of opinions. Academic freedom is therefore the very opposite of a free play of opinions. This need for constraint is part and parcel of the academic world. I will quote here my colleague Olivier Beau, a French jurist who has published 2 important books on academic freedom. Quote, "There can be no freedom of research and teaching granted to these individuals unless they are faithful to the scientific methods of their own discipline and equally faithful to the methods of recruitment and evaluation of their peers. From this constraint flows the absolute necessity of professional self-regulation, which brings with it the prerogative of faculties and universities to govern themselves. This presupposes a university community sufficiently coherent and self-confident to submit to internal rules of discipline and to admit the validity of control procedures, provided only that they are carried out by peers." Unquote. This is why the confusion between, on one side, academic freedom to produce and disseminate the results of our work, and, on the other side, freedom of expression of political or moral opinions, this confusion is so serious. It undermines the very foundations of what justifies the specificity of our status, the autonomy without which our activity could not be carried out. This confusion extends right down to the text governing the academic world. In France, for example, the Code de l'Éducation, Code of Education, drafted in 2000, states, quote, "The public higher education service is secular and independent of any political, economic, religious, or ideological influence. It strives for the objectivity of knowledge. It respects the diversity of opinions. It must guarantee that teaching and research can freely develop scientifically, creatively, and critically," unquote. But this respect for the diversity of opinions is completely out of place here, and once again bears witness to the confusion between academic freedom and freedom of expression. The opinion that the earth is flat or that God created the world has no place at all in our amphitheaters, and not only can but must be censored there, precisely in the name of the objectivity of knowledge. In other words, this article, this official juridical article, sets out 2 contradictory assertions, one of which, respect for the diversity of opinions, has the potential consequence of immediately ruining the foundations of the other, respect for the objectivity of knowledge. In short, not only is academic freedom not freedom of expression, it is its opposite. Thus, no researcher could complain of being censored because his article was rejected by an academic journal. He would be making a fool of himself if he invoked freedom of expression in his defense. And I finish with a few reflections. If we are to see clearly and arrive at a consensual definition of academic freedom that avoids the abuses not in this appeal, we need to redefine it in a contradictory double movement. On the one hand, a restriction of its definition, and on the other hand, an extension of its definition. The restriction consists in limiting academic freedom to the production and transmission of knowledge, to the exclusion of the expression of opinions. Opinions that either do not conform to the constraints of establishing collectively and professionally controlled knowledge, for example, creationism or Holocaust denial, or that reflect moral or political standards, for example, the obligation to use inclusive writing or to cite authors on the basis of their gender or race, the ban on using terms deemed politically incorrect, and so on. These opinions should therefore be excluded from any protection under academic freedom because they have no place in the scientific arena. As for the second movement in this redefinition of academic freedom, namely the extension of the definition of academic freedom, it must take into account of the fact that the current context is no longer the same as that in which the notion of academic freedom was elaborated in America in 1915 and subsequently adopted in various European countries. At the same time, the threats to academic freedom, at this time, the threat to academic freedom were essentially threefold: the religious authorities, the political authorities, and the patrons who, at least in America, ensured the economic operation of the universities. The defense of academic freedom was therefore essentially aimed at threats from outside the academic world. Today, we need to extend the sphere of academic freedom not only to threats from outside the university, but also to threats from within, that is, from academics themselves. In other words, it is no longer the status of the objector or even of the censor that must constitute the criterion for defining academic freedom, but the status of the norms invoked to restrict it. If these norms are strictly scientific, they have their place, and the constraint of logical, conceptual, methodological, bibliographical rigor can and indeed must imperatively apply. But when it comes to moral, political, or aesthetic standards, they must be radically banned from the discussion. No colleague, and even less so, no student collective, should be able to forbid us from studying this or quoting that, no matter how legitimate the causes they invoke. And so, in a few final words, what academic freedom is not. Academic freedom is not freedom of expression, which concerns all citizens and is subject only to the legal regulations laid down by law. Academic freedom is not the license given to every academic to express personal opinions or defend political positions in the context of his or her duties as a teacher and researcher. Such expression is lawful in the civil context of the public arena, but not in the academic context, which must remain the place of knowledge, of verified knowledge of science. Academic freedom is not the freedom of teachers and researchers to evade the requirements of scientific objectivity and neutrality imposed by their peers. It is the demands of the world outside the academy that are proscribed. Academic freedom is about enabling scholars to resist the heteronomous demands of the religious, moral, and political spheres. Even, and this is the novelty, when these demands are expressed by members of the academic world, as it is the case nowadays with the woke movement. That is why today, wokeism is the worst enemy of academic freedom, all the more when it pretends to use it as a protection of activism inside the academic world, as we have seen with the bill I quoted. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have a reply by Professor of University of Leiden, philosophy of law, and also an expert in history.
Sorry, we do it in English. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Nathalie Einich, for a wonderful lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, I had the privilege yesterday already to read the text. So let me first say something about the text, and if there is enough time, I can add some personal reflections, perhaps. Let me start by saying that I am very much impressed by the work of Nathalie Einich. I think it's a wonderful book that she has written, Le Bouquisme Sérétine un totalitarisme. It's a wonderful overview of a lot of problems that we are confronted with in political debate, ideological debate, intellectual debate, but also the predicament of the universities. And I think, and I agree also with Nathalie Einich. May I say, Nathalie, that's easier.
Yes.
Yes. Einich. I very much agree with Nathalie that also the universities and the research institutions are in a very difficult phase, and I like to highlight her final words. Wokeism is the worst enemy of academic freedom, all the more when it pretends to use it as a protection of activism. She also spoke of academo activism, and there is a clear difference there between the Bloc, I think, the second speaker, and also Lemmens. That's so Lemmens and the Bloc. I do not know whether you read Dutch, but they are a bit relativistic about the dangers of woke, and we're on the side of well, that's a real problem for the universities. Woke. So there is a difference, I think, between the speakers who are about to speak and also the books that I have read of those authors, all published, by the way, in 2023. So it was a very rich year for important books on this subject. Let me go back to that start of Nathalie, and that declaration, or was it a kind of manifesto of the group of people who vindicated the right to free speech, but that behind the smoke green of vindication of academic freedom. And I think that you very well explained to us, to the public, that there is a very clear difference. And those people who are basically academo activists.
They are our colleagues.
Sorry?
They are our colleagues.
Yeah, right, yes. They are political activists who want, basically, I think, to take over the university and make that a kind of theater for public political statements. And I also think that you made a very diligent distinction between this kind of activism and what you call scholarly work or academic work that works with peer review, it works with a kind of nuanced approach, also a diversity of viewpoints that you try to balance, and this is certainly not that. Apart from that, by the way, there is also a kind of bitterness I experience if I read that text. It's a text from November 2023. On October 7, we had the Hamas-led invasion of Israel, and a few days later, or less than a month, I do not know the exact day, those people are complaining about the fact that the Palestinian point of view is insufficiently treated in academia. that's a very unlikely proposition. I mean, even in the terms of numbers, I mean, how many supporters of the Palestinian point of view are there in the university contrasted with the people who side on the Israeli side? So it's totally untrue, it's strange, it's written in a kind of postmodern gobbledygook with terms as hegemony and those kind of things. That's, by the way, interesting, because if you notice that kind of vocabulary, then you know, oh, there's something fishy there. So you have to be on your guard, and that's also very important with this kind of text. So thank you for making that distinction between freedom of speech, a right of civilians, and also, well, you can say for academics in their free time, in their spare time. But what the university has to protect is the academic freedom. And it is the university administrators, by the way, it's the deans and the rectores who have made great mistakes here. Because if the university as a whole, what these people probably require from a dean, takes a stance in the kind of conflict, the Israeli-Palestine conflict or the Russian-Ukraine conflict and those kind of things, well, that's already, there it starts, problems. And those people do some of the things that they require from their university boards. And you have at all universities, I suppose also in France, but certainly in the Netherlands as well, in the Flemish universities, that some people say, well, the dean, now you have to say something about Israel and Gaza, or you have to. That's totally silly. Apart from the fact that the dean is totally incompetent, is an administrator. So how can a dean take a position in such difficult international problems? That's like asking from the dean, who is a social scholar, taking a position on the theory of relativity of Albert Einstein. But that's a kind of a demand that people who are infected with the woke virus, sorry for my perhaps what provocative term, that's what they basically ask. Now it's interesting, I think, going a little bit further on this topic, also to ask, well, it is academo-activists. You call them academo-activists. You can also say, perhaps, well, for the discussion then, these are left-wing academo-activists, because it's hardly ever right-wing, is it not? You do not see demonstrations at universities about, well, let's say, the right of Israel to exist, or something like that. It's very much a problem of the left. And I suppose that perhaps you, I do not know you well enough for that, but you identify yourself as more left-wing than right-wing. That's possible, and Nadia Gertz will also do that. But I think you are then, within the left-wing community, quite an exception, because most of the left-wing voices nowadays, they are at the other side of the spectrum. And that makes the book by the Block also interesting. Is it important whether universities are more left-wing or right-wing? Well, I think it does, and the Block confronts us with a wealth of material that makes it clear that there is a very, very important left-wing bias at universities in general, and that's also a problem, perhaps an even greater problem, the problem of woke, or the same, or in any case, I think they go a little bit together. Right, so this is all praise for the distinction between academic freedom and freedom of expression. Then it becomes interesting, of course, whether those academics have the right to express themselves and engage in politics within the university? Do they have a right to demonstrate within the university, to cancel the lectures of professors who are at the wrong side of the discussion, for instance? I'm inclined to think that what the university has to protect, academic work in the ordinary sense of the term, can continue. Also within the buildings. I mean, those kind of people, those demonstrators, they also want to be, they can enter here, for instance, with their slogans and stop this conference, and that kind of activity is something that you can expect from the people who sign up to this declaration, and that's very obnoxious, I think. And it frustrates our work, our conferences, our lectures, and that's very dangerous. But we have to distinguish this position from the position where those people say, no, we do not do politics at the university. The only thing is we assemble together after 6 and, we take a political position. I'm inclined to think that the last option is open to them. But the first option, certainly not. Then a short note on if it's possible, a short note on freedom of speech. And you also wrote another paper, Nathalie. You made a contribution to a book on Salman Rushdie, Pensée Salman Rushdie, a new form of, what you would call literally Holocaust denial, but is in French négationnisme, so denialism, Islamo-gauchisme, Islamofascisme. And what you notice there, that is that not only there's a discussion on academic freedom, there's also a discussion on freedom of speech. And that brings us to Koen Lemmens' book that I have also read with great admiration, 11 essays on freedom of speech. But Koen is at the other side of Nathalie, I think, in the following sense, that the problem is addressed for freedom of speech in general by Nathalie with the concept coined by Pierre-André Taguieff. There is a kind of Islamofascism, and there is a kind of Islamo-leftism, which is very dominant at the universities, and which makes it hardly possible to address the right questions of the limitation of the right to free speech that we are confronted with here. And what is that? Well, Koen Lemmens starts with 2015, a bit similar to your position. You start here with Salman Rushdie, but he started with 2015, which was, of course, the execution, most people call it the massacre of the editorial office of Charlie Hebdo, but I call it a kind of execution. It's shut, bomb, 12 times. They were all executed, basically. So it's a kind of, indeed, vigilantism. That's also a term that you use in the wokisme. And I think that's indeed where we started to have very serious problems with freedom of speech. The Kouachi brothers, who were the jihadist murderers of the whole of the 12 cartoonists, they abolished basically freedom of speech, and they made it so difficult not only to make cartoons, but also to express yourself free on Islamism, and everything that has to do with that specific area. So the people, the authors of the manifest should take notice of the fact that it is increasingly also for academic scholars difficult to address the questions that we have with freedom of speech and the assault on that in 2015. And basically, I think it's not exaggerated, and I know I'm here on the side of Nathalie as well, to say it was basically abolished in 2015. And the legal scholars who say, well, it's who write treatises on freedom of speech and all the case law of the Handyside case and the Otto Preminger case and ES versus Austria, it's a kind of it's irrelevant, because the problem we are confronted with, it's on the right-hand side of the dia. You see my book, Theoterrorism versus Freedom of Speech. It's a cartoon contest in Texas. And what we see there, that is a man with a Kalashnikov protecting free speech. The free speech of the cartoonists, basically. And that's what we have to deal with very brute violence. And it doesn't help when, for instance, a judge in the Netherlands or France says, well, yeah, you have to right of free speech. Well, Salman Rushdie knows now that he has no right of free speech. And what he also knows is that the American state is not able to protect him adequately, as the British state was not, and no other state in the world is. So, thank you for your thoughts, and I look forward to the further conversation.
I think all the major... No, please stay there, because the public also has a chance to ask questions. I think all the major... Yes, please, you can... So also important for the next speakers, so after you just stay here. And so I think all the major issues have been already talked about. There's wokeism, there's left-wing bias, academic freedom versus freedom of speech, and the role of the university as an institution in this whole arena. I would like to give the floor to the audience. Questions? Yes, there is Jan. Please mention your name so that we all know.
Jan de Kaluwe. I'm not an academic, so I'm an observer. And when I hear this, I have the following question. I hear that the enemy is almost within the university, the left-wing bias, and that is a new fact. That's what I understood. And my question is, how did we get here? I have this hypothesis, and I just want to see if that makes sense, or if you think I'm telling nonsense. Did we make the university too democratic? Because I think that some years ago, some decades ago, maybe people went to the university for a vocation with a passion. They really had to want it very hard. And then now it's like everybody has to go to university. That's what we tell everybody. So maybe you get then also a shift to the kind of things that people study at university. Some faculties have become much larger in the process than others. Can this be an explanation for what has happened in universities?
Thank you. Fair question.
Yes. First, I have to say that the threat would be as important if it was a right-wing introduction of topics in the university. Today it's left-wing, but if it was right-wing, it would be the same threat, in my opinion. The threat is on the autonomy of knowledge and scientific work. So your hypothesis is interesting. Maybe, well, it should be thought of. But more than democratization, I think that the problem comes from the lack of control and insightful of the autonomy of the academic role. It means that I think that people who are in the academia have not been attentive enough to be absolutely rigorous on the fact that academia is the place for production and dissemination of knowledge, and that's all. And so what happened with democratization is the introduction not so much, I think, of people coming from the lower classes or of more people, but of norms that come from outside, from the civic arena, and not from inside, from the scientific arena. And this is, I think, the responsibility of academics themselves. They have not been attentive enough to protect their own boundaries from outside pressures, norms, and so on. This would be my answer.
Small comments?
Well, yeah, sure.
How did we get here?
Sorry?
How did we get here?
Yeah, how did we get here? Well, it's a combination of two. Am I? Yes? It's
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. How did we get here? Well, I have worked for 40 years at the University of Leiden. So 40 years, well, long time. 7 years as a philosopher at the University of Delft. What I remember that when I started at the university at 1984, I was free in my agenda. I could choose my own projects that I wanted to be involved in. Great freedom, no censorship from the side of university administrators, great tolerance also, for what you can call viewpoint diversity, which is very different from the kind of diversity that is sold to us nowadays. Viewpoint diversity, very, very interesting. But this has changed. And this has also changed, I think, under the influence of the financing of the universities. Nowadays, people have to conform with their research to the social development goals of the United Nations, with all kinds of regulation from the EU. There is no free agenda anymore for scientists and scholars, and that's a very, very big problem. The scholarship has also became ideologized. Now, in the law faculties, we were relatively safe because we had a lot of students, and we earned our money basically by lecturing to the students. But in all kinds of other sciences, that's not the case. And especially not in the social sciences, I think. So that's a big difference, and the reason why I'm active for Hypatia, that is because I want for the next generation, I want them to enjoy the freedom that I had 20, 25, 30 years ago.
Thank you. We have one more question. Notice that there will be a panel discussion at the end of our colloquium, and there you can also ask questions. But so we have to keep track of time a bit, so please, yes?
This question is probably for Professor Lemmens, because he wrote a book. I didn't read it, I'm going to read it. But freedom of speech, I think we need to take it back to 2002, Islamofascism, when Pim Fortuyn was assassinated. Now, it didn't start in 2015. Professor Lemmens started in 2015. But the killing of freedom of speech started in the Netherlands with the assassination of Pim Fortuyn. Thank you.
Boudewijn, small question.
Yeah, I have a question for Madame Heinig. How do you assess the impact of authors like Foucault and postmodernists on the whole academic, on the evolution in academic discourse? I have the impression that their impact was crucial in a very negative way, but I would like to hear your opinion about that.
Yes, the impact of what we call French theory on American academy has been enormous, and it is one of the reasons why wokeism developed so easily, as the idea that knowledge would be only the reflection of dominant positions, and so there would be no objectivity of knowledge, everything would be relative, and that people people would have the right to protest if a kind of knowledge doesn't fit their vision of the world as a minority, and so on and so on. So there is a close connection between the American use of French theory, which has no relationship with the real French theory. I wrote a small piece if you read French, in an online journal called Telos, which is called French Theory, Petit Malentendu Transatlantique, small transatlantic misunderstandings, where I show the differences between what were originally the authors of French theory, Foucault, Derrida, and so on, and what Americans did of it. So this is, of course, important because it created a climate of devalorization of objectivity, and this is terrible for the academy. So if you are interested, 3 years ago we organized, we means a collective, a little like Hypatia, that we created in January 2021, so 3 years ago, called the Observatoire des idéologies identitaires, Observatory of Ideological Identity Ideologies. If you go and see it in Google, you will. It's in French, but for those who can read French, you will have a lot of articles and analysis. And in January 2022, we organized a big conference at La Sorbonne, which had a lot of tremendous, which was very much discussed and of course very much attacked by wokists as something coming from the extreme right, which was not at all. We were a lot of good academics, let's say, serious academics. And it was about deconstruction, exactly. It was a relationship between wokism and deconstruction. And for those who read French, how do you say, les actes du colloque? They have been the proceedings. Thank you, have been published at Odile Jacob, so you can find it. It's very interesting. So there is, of course, a relationship, and from this American appropriation of French theory as a delegitimization of objective knowledge, it passed the Atlantic, and it went above the Atlantic and arrived in Europe as this new trend, which is extremely recent. You know, it's 4 years old, in fact, which has become extraordinarily powerful in a very short time, and against which we are trying to fight now. But it has several roots to this intellectual root, but also a very important religious root. I can go back to that later if you want.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, both speakers. Now have thrown French theory in the mix.
Yeah.
Also,
French theory distorted by the Americans.
We'll come back to that issue in the final panel discussion. I think it's also a very interesting and important aspect of the whole thing. Our next speaker is my own colleague at the Institute of Philosophy in Leuven, who is going to talk about bias, left-wing bias in academia, and more specifically, I think, in the social sciences. I give him the floor, and then our own Astrid will give some comments, and then the floor is yours. And then we have some. Okay, so Andreas.
Opening the file. So, thanks for the invite. Thank you for introducing me, Philip. So, in my talk, I will explore the relationship between, on the one hand, ideologically motivated censorship in academia, and on the other hand, ideologically motivated self-censorship in academia. And I will almost exclusively talk about the, intra-academic censorship. And it means that both the perpetrator and the victim and the target of the censoring is an academic. I will defend 3 claims or argue for 3 views. First, I will argue for the view that censorship, academic censorship, ideologically motivated censorship, is a cause of the underrepresentation of right-leaning and conservative academics in academia. Secondly, I will argue that the underrepresentation of conservatives and right-leaning people in academia actually aggravates the already damaging effects of censorship. And thirdly, I will try to show that self-censorship may sound kind of obvious. I will try to show that self-censorship is a very rational response to censorship, and maybe a more rational response than some people seem to think. Now, we're all familiar, I guess everybody here in the room is familiar with what is nowadays called cancel culture, and cancel culture revolves around high-profile cases, such as the retraction of journal papers, the disinviting speakers. So there's an academic who invites another controversial academic to speak about a controversial topic, and then there are protests, petitions, etc., that ask for the withdrawal of the invitation, and then that happens. And sometimes cancel culture can go as far as the firing of academics or the firing of journal editors, and all this for political reasons. Now, when you're talking about academic censorship, these examples, these cases of cancel culture, are the ones that immediately and naturally come to mind. And there's nothing wrong with it. I think these are really prime examples of academic censorship. On the other hand, and maybe that's a 4th claim that I will argue for, although mostly implicitly, on the other hand, there are less visible types of censorship, and maybe these less visible types are more damaging, more problematic, in part because they are less visible, and also because they occur more. So I will argue for 4 claims, and the talk itself is divided into 2 parts. First, censorship. Secondly, self-censorship. Sort of obvious. Okay. So in academia, well, as far as we know, left-leaning, progressive, liberal people have outnumbered conservative, right-leaning people for, well, at least since the middle of the 20th century. That's what the data show. What the data also show is that the overrepresentation of left-leaning liberal people in progressive people, the overrepresentation of those people in academia has increased, especially the last 5 decades, and especially since, say, the late 1980s, the early 1990s. So the gap has been there, like forever, but the gap has widened, has become more prominent. And to be clear, all the data that you see here on this slide, they come from the US, and the trend is very well documented in the US. But all the data that we have, and maybe those data are a little less robust than the data from the US, the data that we have from, say, the UK or from Western Europe, all point in a similar direction. So also in the UK, for instance, beginning of the 1970s, like 30% of the academics voted for the Tories, voted for the Conservative Party. That number has now dropped to 10%. Similar trends in the Low Countries, in voting behavior, in self-identification, etc. So that means that a conservative academic, and there are a few here, that you conservatives among you, that you have become a rarity in academia. Now, this is true for, interestingly, and contrary to what many people think, this is true for basically all disciplines. Perhaps with the interesting exception of agronomy, maybe we can talk about that later during the Q&A, but basically all disciplines, chemistry, engineering, law, medicine, etc. But of course in some disciplines the unrepresentation of conservative people and right-leaning people is more dramatic, more pronounced than in other disciplines. And this is particularly the case in, you all guess, and you all guess it right, social sciences and the humanities. For instance, when we look at anthropology, like less than 5% of academics in anthropology self-identify as conservative or right-leaning, and some of the more recent surveys actually suggest that the number has dropped to 1-2%. In other disciplines like political science, philosophy, psychology as well, the number of conservatives is also very low, below 10%. So that means that for every conservative right-leaning philosopher, for instance, you have 8 to 9 liberal, progressive, left-leaning philosophers. So they have become a rarity in academia in general, but in some disciplines they almost went extinct. And a couple of years ago I received an email from an English college at a prestigious British university, you can guess which of the two, who sent me an email telling me that he was a conservative, and he wrote to me, and I quote, "It's sometimes all gets a bit little Brit, the only conservative in the room at conferences, the only conservative in the room during seminars, the only conservative in the room in classrooms, suppose that you're a student." And that's actually what is happening in more and more fields. Now, if we compare the underrepresentation of conservatives and right-leaning people in universities with the underrepresentation of other groups, there are a few striking elements. So, the underrepresentation of conservatives is way more prominent than the underrepresentation of, say, female scholars. Now, the initiatives at universities by our administrators, and that are done in the light of diversity, they are often aimed at improving or reducing actually this underrepresentation of women. I have no problem with that, to be clear. But when it comes to the underrepresentation of right-leaning people or conservatives, basically there are no workshops, there are no courses, there are no diversity committees that develop initiatives to address this underrepresentation. And actually, I'm part of the diversity committee myself, and you see plenty of initiatives for people from the LGBTQ+ community, whereas people from the, to make them feel more welcome at universities, whereas, as you can see from this table, whereas people from that community are actually overrepresented in academia, and you might guess that they feel already quite welcome, whereas it seems that, conservatives do not feel that welcome, or do not seem to be that welcome at universities, in research institutions. Now, this lack of initiative to address the underrepresentation of conservatives and right-leaning people might explain that the gap is there and that the gap keeps growing. Yeah, that might be one of the explanations. But what are the other explanations? Are, left-leaning people just more intelligent, or do left-leaning people constitute, or are there more left-leaning people among the exceptionally bright, because universities tend to recruit basically or mostly from that group of exceptionally bright people? Or is it the case that like deep insight into the nature of reality or structure of reality or into human nature makes somebody more liberal? Or is it actually the case that right-leaning people care a lot about money and academia just doesn't pay that well? Which is obviously not true. I'm being way too much. Well, all of these factors explain a bit of the gap that is observed, but only a bit, and they fall short in explaining the gap that we're seeing, and they definitely fall short when it comes to an explanation of the widening of the gap. Why has it become so pronounced over the last 30 years, and basically, well, everywhere in the Western world? It seems that, well, and all the researchers who study this topic agree that these factors cannot fully account for the facts. And it seems that a very important factor that explains this gap and the widening of the gap is self-selection. And self-selection has to do with the fact that, well, conservatives, when they think of a career, when they think of profession, of vocation, well, they don't think of themselves as a researcher or a professor or an academic. And they don't think of themselves as a researcher or a professor because they think that, well, I wouldn't fit in an environment. I would probably fit better in an environment, say, as a Physician, or a medical environment, or as a dentist, or I would probably flourish in the military. So those are the sort of careers that they consider, and they tend, well, not to consider academic careers. And that has to do because they think, with the fact that they think they, well, do not really fit within that academic environment. But why is it the case that they don't really fit in that academic environment? And now we come to the topic of today. Well, that seems, at least that has to do, at least in part, with the fact that they are not welcome in the academy. Yeah? They are discriminated against directly or more indirectly. In 2019, and I can't see my speaker notes, which is going to make it really difficult for me now, but in 2019 I did a survey with a couple of colleagues among academic philosophers. And what came out of that survey, well, the first part was mainly about ideological orientation of academics, and that part showed that most academics were, as we already knew, most philosophers in the academy are left-leaning or even lean to the far left. The second part was about what is called willingness to discriminate against people, and willingness to discriminate against ideas, and willingness to discriminate against ideas is, of course, what people generally call censorship. That's willingness to discriminate against ideas. And what we found was that there is a willingness to discriminate on the part of conservatives to discriminate against left-leaning people, and a bit more pronounced willingness to discriminate among left-leaning people against conservatives. And the willingness to discriminate is quite substantial if you look at the figures. Like over 50% is willing to discriminate at least occasionally in hiring decisions of left-leaning people. Is willing to discriminate in hiring decisions against conservative candidates. Around 40%, a bit over 40%, is willing to discriminate, progressives is willing to discriminate at least occasionally against funding applications that they think are too conservative or too right-leaning. Suppose a grant that is devoted to a topic that is seen as conservative or right-wing, but they're willing to discriminate against or to willing to censor that sort of project application. Now these findings are interesting, I think, and they are in line with other findings of previous surveys. For instance, in 2012, Joel Inbar and Joris Lammers did a survey among social and personality and social psychologists, and they came up with roughly the same figures. They were a bit lower. This is 2012. Our survey was 2019. This is about psychologists. Our survey was among philosophers. But they found that liberals, 35% of liberals would occasionally, often, or always discriminate against conservatives in hiring decisions. 25% of them would discriminate against conservatives in reviewing their grant applications. So it's a bit lower than our figure, but still substantial numbers. Honeycutt and Freiberg did a similar survey among academics of all disciplines, but limited to the University of California system. We were familiar with US Academy, you know what I'm talking about. And what they came up with was basically almost exactly the same numbers as Inbar and Lammers. And they also showed that, unlike Inbar and Lammers, that it goes both ways. Yeah, that conservatives are also willing to discriminate against liberals. And you might think, well, both groups are willing to discriminate against each other, so, well, very gay. Yeah, very gay. It's a draw. Well, it isn't. It isn't. Why isn't it? Well, obviously, because there are mutually reinforcing effects of underrepresentation and discrimination. So what you see in our survey, for instance, is that left-leaning folks, left-leaning individuals, are at least as willing to discriminate against right-leaning people as the right-leaning are willing to discriminate against the left. And there is some intra-left willingness to discriminate, but that's another issue. And there are many more left-leaning individuals in nearly all disciplines, especially in philosophy, and it means that right-leaning individuals are much more likely to be the target of discrimination than the left-leaning. And I quantify this a bit in the case of project applications and research project applications, because that's also a topic that I study as a philosopher of science, how this works. And in philosophy and in many other disciplines, you have regularly, most funding agencies, most funding bodies aim for it to have at least 4 reviews. Now, suppose that you're in a field where, like philosophy, where 75% identify as progressive and 50% of those progressives are willing to discriminate against conservative applications. That means that the probability that you get at least one progressive reviewer who will discriminate against your application is super high. 0.84. That's super high. Knowing that, well, the success rate of applications is generally very low, around 20%, and there are many other reasons to reject an application than just the ideological leaning of that project. So basically you don't stand a chance if your project has any ideas that are easily identified as conservative in it, or some sort of fits within a conservative or right-leaning agenda. And when you compare that to the experience or the probability that a left-leaning grant application will actually be confronted with at least one discriminatory review, well, then you see that's below 0.2. Now, you might wonder, why is he using that number of 50%? Because he said in his survey it was like 42%, and the surveys of Honeycutt and Freiberg and Inbar and Lammers said 25% when it comes to grant applications. Well, that has to do with, of course, these surveys, even these anonymous surveys, people tend to answer these in a socially desirable way. They tend to opt for socially desirable answers. And this likely leads to an underestimation of the willingness to discriminate. And Kaufman writes on this topic, he has some research on the topic, and suggests that realistic estimates, that is based on his list experiments, is a particular method that is used to see how many people are actually giving socially desirable answers, suggest a multiplier of 2 when it comes to willingness to discriminate. Yeah. So 42 occasionally, well, say 80% occasionally. Now, maybe that means just more than sometimes, but what does it actually mean? I guess that it will be roughly around 50% that would most of the time discriminate against applications. Secondly, a lot of people do not recognize their willingness to discriminate or to censor as such. Then they think, yeah, well, most of this right-leaning research is just really very bad research. And there is some sort of implicit bias against ideological proponents, because these right-leaning projects do not share your assumptions, your convictions, your beliefs, etc. But they are just less plausible than other project proposals. And of course, you have to add to this anti-conservative bias, you have to add an ideological in-group favoritism. Very often, people have to choose between, say, a project that deals with the effect of climate change on the rise of indigenous people and the effect of climate change on economic growth, and the measures against climate change that they have on economic growth. Very often people will think, well, the first project is really tackling a really important issue. That's an issue that actually aligns with their ideological preference. So, hence the 50%. Now, before I go to the self-censorship topic, I want to say one extra kind of disclaimer or a kind of warning. Very often, right-leaning and conservative people, in my experience, tend to interpret this as, well, based on this willingness to discriminate based on evil motives. But I don't think that is the case. And Corey Clark and colleagues wrote a theoretical conceptual paper in 2023 arguing, and I think that their arguments are quite convincing, arguing that the real motive behind this willingness to discriminate is they want to protect what they see as the potential victims of that research. And that's the main driver of this, or the main motive for this willingness to discriminate. So what you see is, well, self-selection, but it's not just that conservatives leave the academia, they are pushed out. Because publications and grants, if you don't manage to get your papers published, and if you don't manage to get funding, that means that you probably won't be chosen when it comes to a particular job. And add to that the willingness to discriminate is highest for hiring decisions. So the cards are super stacked against conservatives more directly in hiring decisions. So it's really, really very difficult when you're openly conservative, when you're openly right-leaning, in your project applications, in the topics that you address in your paper, to get hired. So that brings me, of course, to the issue of self-censorship. Because one, at first sight, rational response to this is to self-censor. I'm not going to be openly conservative or openly right-leaning. When you're the only conservative in the room, as my British colleague is, rather than being that obnoxious person who keeps on, whatever, complaining about wokeism, you're going to be the person who remains silent, maybe even tries to pass as a liberal or a progressive. That's often what happens. So I described in the previous part a kind of positive feedback loop, and it looks a bit like this. So conservatives tend to choose less for academic careers than liberals. And we see that at least since the 1950s. It means that they are in the minority in academia, and as soon as they are in the minority, they will get discriminated against by liberal academics, more so than liberal academics will be discriminated against by conservative academics. And as a result, conservatives will complain about it, and then they send a message to other academics, well, it's a nice place to a nice environment to work in as a conservative, and hence other conservatives tend to avoid academic groups. Which means that conservatives become an even smaller minority in academia, and then they start to self-censor. In order to survive. Now, I call it a positive feedback loop, and of course it's a positive feedback loop, but it's rather an undesirable positive feedback loop. How can we break this feedback loop? And I know there's something ironic about a speaker who wrote a book that can be seen as complaining about the leftist academia, that very speaker comes up with a message, well, the best thing we can do is stop complaining. Stop complaining. Because, yeah, the book is to some extent a complaint. But this is the advice that you often hear and that I support to some extent. Be open and vocal about your political views and preferences, don't complain, and the best way to avoid or to counter stigmatization is visibility. And that's true for all sorts of minority groups. Visibility is a really good way to counter, to address stigmatization. And rather than trying to pass on the right, to remain in the closet as a conservative, you should come out of the closet. You should not try to pass conservative, but be openly conservative or right-leaning. Now, there's a catch. And the catch is the benefits are for others and the costs are actually for the openly conservative professors. And that's especially true for junior academics without tenure. Think of the situation in the 1960s, early 1970s. Suppose you're a gay person and you're passing as straight. And it takes a lot of courage to come out of the closet. And you can see now, with the benefit of hindsight, and of course with the benefit of 3 decades of the gay rights activism, thank you very much, but it was just a good thing to do. But there were real costs for those people who came out of the closet. Yeah, they were ostracized, they were frowned upon, they were sometimes they were medicalized, etc., etc. So there were real costs involved for them, and the benefits were reaped by future generations. And something similar probably happens in academia. And Brian Kaplan, one of my favorite academics, Brian Kaplan has written a couple of really controversial books, The Case Against Education. I can't recommend it to everybody, even though most conservatives would agree, but the Case Against Education. He wrote recently a book against feminism, Don't Be a Feminist. And he was on Tucker Carlson, and later on he defended his opinions on Tucker Carlson in a very nice blog post, arguing that Tucker Carlson is actually a better person than most of his fellow academics. That was really, really surprising. And then Kaplan, who's, to be clear, an opponent of tenure, of academic tenure, says, well, I'm tenured, so if I don't speak out, who will? And I'm perfectly protected by tenure. So if tenure doesn't unleash your candor, what will? We all have to be more open-faced, more candid than we currently are. Yeah. Well, I think, in a way, Kaplan has a point, and it is a point that is repeated over and over again by many of my progressive left-leaning colleagues. Blue rights, conservatives, right-leaning people, who complain about cancel culture, but actually what happens is that tenured people, they don't get fired, they actually step down or they resign, and then they're these drama queens complaining about wokeism, but they have tenure. That's the idea. And, well, I think that self-censorship is motivated by self-protection from censorship and its professional implications, and that these direct professional implications are rather small. Yeah, definitely these costs are way lower for tenured professors. If I would take a stand on a conservative stand, right-leaning stand on a particular issue, argued for the stand or that position, then I'm pretty sure I won't get fired. But there are other costs involved. Yeah? If the costs that are involved are also social costs, we will be ostracized. The conservatives who are open about their conservatism will be ostracized socially. Yeah, you like to speak with people after conference. Yeah, you don't want them to avoid you. You don't want them to not to like your post on social media because they think they might be associated with you. You want to be invited to the barbecues of your colleagues, etc., etc. And of course, as soon as you're out in the open, those social costs are still very real, even though you have tenure. And secondly, something that is definitely underestimated, is the guilt by association. There is no real research on guilt by association when it comes to ideology, but when it comes to scientific misconduct, people who happen to, unfortunately, have collaborated with people who have violated scientific integrity, well, they are seen as also culpable and they are avoided and so on. So you can imagine that it also happens, and people who have worked with me, and tenured people, have occasionally encountered these reactions. Yeah. So that's, I perceive that as conservative or right-leaning. You've worked with that person, you've written on topics with that person that sound a bit weird, these titles or these abstracts, and yeah, the problem not going to select you for the interview round. So that's the sort of thing that occurs. Now I conclude what to do. There are no easy fixes. Definitely not, well, not in the short term, but also not in the long run. Some people suggest, like Rory Clark suggests, to make reviews public, and there is something to say for that. But you know, as soon as you will make these reviews public, people will be, well, they will still be as negative about the contributions, but they will mask the ideological motivation probably more than they do now. Yeah? And I'm all for more accountability in the review process, but that won't do the job, I think. I think one solution, and it's something that is very dear to me, one solution here would be to reform the funding system. Yesterday, I think, was Henry Claes. Henry Claes was elected as a new rector at U Antwerpen. Rick van der Wallen at UGent has also, well, they also decided to have basic funding rather than the more traditional peer-reviewed project application-based funding that we have, where these effects of ideologically motivated censorship probably hit people the most. So that's probably one of the tools that we can use against this problem. And then, of course, there is also affirmative action for conservatives in academia that we desperately need. That's all in the long run, and in the short run, what I would actually recommend is reduce your confidence in findings from politicized academic fields. Probably, since you're here, you have already done that to some extent, but reduce your confidence in those findings. And I end with a quote of John Stuart Mill, because it actually says what this last quote says, right? What this last bullet point says: if even the Newtonian philosophy were not permitted to be questioned, mankind could not feel as complete assurance of its truth as they do now. The beliefs which we have most warrant for have no safeguard to rest on, but a standing invitation to the whole world to prove them unfounded. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. Very interesting and informative talk. Lots of questions, I guess. But first we have Astrid Elbert, who organized this colloquium for us. I think she... Astrid, you have the floor, and then we open up the discussion for a couple of questions. I remind you that at the end of your colloquium we have a sort of general discussion where we can raise all the questions. Yes, please, Astrid. Oh, yes. Astrid, so she organized. She works at the University of Antwerp here. Sorry, I apologize. She's a trained historian. She worked on the history of astronomy and wrote a PhD on that topic at the University of Leiden in Holland. And now she's a language specialist and also teaches here for languages for people around.
Foreigners, Dutch for foreigners.
Thank you. Okay, so Astrid.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for this interesting contribution. I think you gave us a very good and insightful overview of how conservatives and right-wingers disappeared from academia since the 1950s and 60s. And Andreas also wrote a good book about it. Is links gewoon slimmer in Dutch. You will be able to buy it here during the reception. Well, actually I wondered what the situation was in the beginning of the 20th century. Was there back then a preponderance of conservatives, religious people, right-wingers or something? I don't really know whether there exists data about it. I don't guess so. But I know that there were several incidents at American universities, even before McCarthyism, for example. There were incidents with leftist professors. One is illustrative. There was, maybe you know him, the British philosopher Bertrand Russell. He was offered a professorship in 1940 at the City College of New York. But he was an atheist, politically associated with labor, and ethically and sexually very progressive. So some conservative religious leaders campaigned against Russell's appointment on the grounds that he was a godless advocate of free love. Even a family of Brooklyn filed a lawsuit alleging that Russell's presence on campus could corrupt the morals of their young daughter, who might attend City College in the future. And this family won in court, and so therefore the then mayor decided to withdraw funding for Russell's position. I think that would not be possible nowadays. But so for professors with openly leftist or progressive ideas, it was not so self-evident to get in academia in the first half of the 20th century. But then afterwards, the situation changed, as you explained, Andreas. We don't really know exactly why, you say, but probably it has to do with self-selection on the one hand and direct and indirect discrimination against conservative people on the other hand. Well, what I missed a little bit was the spiral of silence thesis. This was a thesis for the first time formulated by Elizabeth Noel Neumann in 1974. It was a theory, and afterwards there were several variations on it. And it is a thesis that explains how mainstream values in any group, not only in academia, gradually flourish to become the predominant culture, while due to social pressure, that dissenting minority voices become muted. So what is happening in academia, where a certain group becomes more and more dominant, is actually an example of that spiral of silence thesis. Now, of course, this spiral of silence thesis explains how mainstream values become dominant, but it does not explain why these specific values become dominant. Why, for example, did the right-wingers disappear from academia in the second half of the 20th century and not the left-wingers? But you don't really seem to have a conclusive explanation for that. But there has been a great amount of research on it. For example, there was the book Cultural Backlash from Norris and Engelhardt in 2019. They mentioned this research. And it says that cultures in post-industrial societies, such as Western Europe, the US, and so on, they have gradually become far more socially liberal towards many moral issues, endorsing, for example, more fluid sexual and gender identities, support for LGBTQ rights, same-sex marriage, acceptance of ethnic diversity, support for racial justice, and so on. On the other hand, the dominant culture in poorer societies, for example in several African countries, usually remains deeply socially conservative on many moral values, such as those concerning the importance of religion, respect for traditional sexual social norms, marriage, the family, the importance of largely fixed social identities based on sex and gender, race, ethnicity, and so on. So I think that this specific cultural shift in academia is linked to a broader economic and cultural shift in society as a whole. And that was a bit, I think, an historical embeddedness that we have. And related to that, there is very recent research from the summer of 1923, so from last year actually, by, again, Pippa Norris, a political scientist from Harvard. I'm really glad we have this research because she did extensive research on self-censorship. Norris' research showed that in these post-industrial societies, as I mentioned, right-wing scholars were most likely to perceive that they faced an increasingly chilly climate during the last decade. But by contrast, and that is, I think, really interesting, in developing countries, in developing societies characterized by more traditional cultures, like, for example, Nigeria, she mentions, it was left-wing scholars who reported that the cancel culture had also worsened during the past decade. So Norris also did a large international survey, Belgium was also included, to map the problem of self-censorship. It's on the website of Hypatia, by the way. I think this is the first extensive research on self-censorship international. So it's really, it gives some hard data. But I wonder if it is a good idea, actually, to make this distinction between right and left in this respect, because I think that narrows down reality a little bit. What happens in post-industrial societies, such as Western Europe, like we are in the United States, is that, like I already said, they have gradually become far more socially liberal towards many moral issues, and that crosses party lines and also the left-right division, I think. And moreover, it's also not always clear what is politically right and what is left, and these topics can also shift over time. In the book you wrote, Andreas, you also explained that very clearly, and you gave, for example, the example of Margaret Thatcher. She was conservative, but she was the first leader to take climate change seriously, and she put it on the political agenda, while later this topic was adopted by the political left. So I think we don't need more right-wing or left-wing scientists. I think we need more diversity or viewpoint diversity in general. Nevertheless, my plea for more viewpoint diversity does not mean that I think it is a problem in itself that post-industrial rich countries become socially more liberal. Because a liberal climate is a climate in which also freedom of speech and academic freedom can flourish, I think. I'm always a bit suspicious when I hear people defend academic freedom, freedom of speech on the one hand, and then on the other hand, for example, advocating a restrictive sexual moral or a restrictive abortion legislation. I think it is a contradiction to defend one fundamental freedom, academic freedom or freedom of speech, and at the same time to attack other fundamental freedoms. So the fact that, as the research of Norris shows, there is worldwide more cancelling in academia today in all kind of countries, with poor countries and prosperous countries, it may be a sign of a decline in liberty worldwide, and this in turn has maybe something to do with global economic circumstances. I don't know, but maybe it's a hypothesis. And of course, now people may think, yes, but what are we talking about? Right wing, left wing, science just must be value free. But again, in your book, Andreas, you didn't talk much about it now, but you showed in your book that very convincingly that almost every aspect of scientific practice is often value-driven, starting from the research questions to the methods and the data interpretation, to the results of scientific studies and the use of those results by non-scientists. And you also explained why completely value-free science is not possible and also not desirable. But this discussion about whether science is value-free or not, or whether it can be value-free or not, is more than a century old, actually. Yeah? As soon as the modern scientific disciplines arose during the 19th century, scientists already asked themselves the question whether science could and should be value-free. For example, the German sociologist Max Weber already wrote at the end of the 19th century about values in social science. He was a founder of sociology. Weber, he thought that on the one hand, values influence the way in which research is conducted in the social sciences, but on the other hand, it was still possible, he thought, to put aside all value judgment in the process of analysis. But then later there came the logical positivists who were much stricter about the fact that science should be value-free. There was Charles Taylor, who said in the 1960s that political science could not be morally neutral, and so on. And today, the research has even gone further. There was the book of 2019, Political Epistemology, by Pietro Daniel Amodeo, an Italian professor in logic and history of science. Amodeo addresses how even on a meta level, also the sociology and the philosophy of science are not value-free. For example, the British sociology of scientific knowledge has a strong relativistic bias and a leftist democratic connotation. It focuses on the social construction of truth, and that is in opposition to the American paradigm, the Mertonian sociology of science, concerned with problems of efficiency of the academic mechanisms of scientific production and validation. So I think most historians today, most historians and philosophers of science today will say that a completely value-free science is not possible and also not desirable. And then one last remark I want to make is that in your book, and you also said it briefly in your presentation, you said that research questions, or sometimes also whole fields, serve sometimes explicitly leftist or explicit ideological goals. Well, I don't think that is always the case, or I don't think that research questions by definition serve an ideological case, or not, at least not all the examples you mentioned in your book. For example, you said, and you gave an example that if you do a research to the underrepresentation of women in literature, you said that could be identified as a leftist question. But I think this can also be a very neutral question because it is also a question that Dinesh D'Souza, that was an Indian-American writer of the far right, Dinesh D'Souza, he has also done research to the underrepresentation of women in literature, and he's really absolutely not from the right, on the contrary. But of course his explanation is a bit idiosyncratic then. Thank you very much.
Brief reply and then we take questions.
Yeah. Just it's very rich and there is much there are really many things that I could reply to. Just one thing, what we see in the West and in the post-industrial world is really a liberalization of values, and that's tendency that's been there for a while, and on basically every topic. So on basically every topic, there are few exceptions, and there are different explanations for that, but in the context of this topic, my topic then, my talk, I think it's important to see that academics are even more liberal than the general population and also more liberal than most well-educated people. So it isn't an issue of, well, we have all become more liberal. It's an issue that academics are even more liberal than more progressive than most people. And I think many people believe that the liberalization of values that we see in the West is actually something that we should call moral progress, and that we converge on the moral truth or moral facts. I don't think that's the case. I think there are other factors, processes that play a role that have to do with cultural evolution of values, and that as soon as particular values become dominant, there is a kind of a runaway process leading to this liberalization that we see.
Thank you. First question. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes. Thanks ever so much. Tony Gillan from MCC Brussels. It's a fairly simple question. You talked about there being no easy answers. But one thing I haven't heard much said about, but I think it was what Natalie Henrik was getting at partly, and she could correct me if I'm wrong. Haven't heard much about the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. And that's something we rarely hear academics talk about these days. And I wonder whether society and indeed academia has lost sense of its own purpose, its own objective. And if actually we defended the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, instead of constantly allowing academia and higher education to be instrumentalised about everything from the economy to being a sort of kindergarten for grown-up children, if instead of instrumentalising university we defended the pursuit of knowledge, maybe some of the difficulties that you're experiencing wouldn't be so strong because there would be an objective basis for what the university is about.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not against objectivity, and when I emphasize the importance of values in science, it's not as some postmodernist that does that. So I do believe in objectivity. But one of the issues there is the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of knowledge. There are lots of things that we can have knowledge about. You can have knowledge about how many leaves are on the tree outside, and we can study that. So when we select topics that we find valuable, yeah, and that we find worthy to research, and the ones that we select are obviously also driven by our own values, including not just values such as health. Since you're a medical researcher, I mentioned that, not just about health, which is, say, ideologically neutral, but plenty of questions, certainly in fields that are normative in some sort of political sense. In those fields, the questions have always been and will always be partly driven by such political values, and there's basically nothing wrong with that, because we have to select questions. There is a scarcity of resources, of time, of money to research everything. So we have to pick those topics that are relevant. Yeah? And of course, if most researchers are left-leaning, yeah, then there might, and way more left-leaning than the general public, then there might be a problem in the sense that lots of the topics that are researched in academia are topics that most people outside of academia don't think are worthy of such a study. So I think that the solution, let's just be neutral and let's just pursue the truth or knowledge, that's not, of course it's important, but that's not the complete answer to the problems that I was talking about.
Okay, thank you. We have another question.
My name is Tatiana Hashimi, I'm an anthropologist, and I would like to ask you if you don't think that what we see now is the triumph of the Gramscism, the cultural hegemony, and so the university was a good target, and now with the human resources, through the psychology, it really entered the whole society, and especially the economy, and now you see in boards of some very big majors having a very strange position in terms of climate or whatever.
Yeah, so you mentioned the culture of what? Culture of?
The cultural hegemony from Gramsci.
Ah, yeah, okay. Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm not. It's definitely an interesting question, but I don't feel competent to answer it. I'm also not a sociologist, so most of the things that I said that had to do with sociology are not based on my own research. It's just second-hand. So it's really difficult to answer that question, but it's definitely a good question.
Okay.
I'm Paul Verhaert, sociologist from the VUB, the Verenigde State Brussels, and I want to thank you for your excellent book you wrote. I really enjoyed reading it. We agree, I think, on many points, but we also disagree on a few points. And because it is an academic symposium, let's start with questions where we disagree. First, maybe two studies which are a bit disregarded in your book, I think. The first study is about discrimination of right-wing academics, and you always talk about the willingness to discriminate. I'm a researcher doing over 10 years research on discrimination, and there's a huge difference between the willingness to discriminate and actual discriminatory behavior. And one study you cite, but only very shortly, is a study from Niall Gross, and he did actually a kind of corresponding study. So they applied with fictitious candidates to academic positions, and one CV has like a right-wing association on the CV, and the other one a left-wing association, and they didn't find any significant discrimination. So that's the first study I want to cite. Then the second study is the one of Herman van der Wefhorst, also a sociologist, and indeed he confirms what you talked about. The academia is rather left-wing, except maybe for economic distribution. Then academics are actually just like the general population. But when it comes to immigration, when it comes to culture, they're more left-wing. But maybe more important is there room for diversion? That's the standard deviation around the mean in academia. There's a room for other opinions. And there he compared actually the academia with other higher educated professions, and he didn't find any problem over there. So there, that was also a bit less emphasized in your book. And then I come to my third question, and which is actually the most important question. One of your chapters goes about the university as value-driven organizations, and I really enjoyed that chapter. But my question is, what can you do with political positions on the far right or the far left, which goes actually against the values of university? And there you're more silent actually what to do with anti-science, anti-intellectualism positions, which we can find in some political perspectives, what to do with really racist and sexist positions, where even right-wing people or left-wing people really agree like this is really racist. Is a place for those people in the academia or not? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, lots of questions. I'm going to leave the third and the most important question maybe for the panel discussion. I do discuss Van der Wefhorst's research in the book as well, and also Gro's CV study. And indeed, Gro says, well, self-selection plays an important role, and discrimination doesn't seem to play an important role given on based on my CV study. So that's the basis on which where he draws his conclusion from. Now, interestingly, I did together with a postdoc, I did recently some agent-based modeling based on the figures that we have, and it seems that if there is this willingness to discriminate, that would translate to discriminatory behavior, and if that willingness to discriminate was there since the early 1970s, basically there would be no conservative around anymore. They wouldn't be a minority or a rarity in some disciplines. They would have disappeared long ago. Yeah, because it goes really fast. Even if you take academic generations, if you think that academic generations take 30 years, still they would have all but disappeared from academia. So I was thinking about it, and it's interesting to see that the more recent studies on willingness to discriminate show lower numbers than in willingness to discriminate. And the study of Gro's is a study, if I remember well, 2006 or 2003, I think, on discriminatory behavior, 2003. And the more recent studies show a higher willingness to discriminate. Of course, it's difficult to compare these studies because the samples differ and the fields often differ as well. But outside academia, what you also see is a greater, not just, basically there is no stronger political or ideological polarization in society, but what is the case is actually that there is more affective polarization. Yeah, that people see each other more and more as enemies, and not just as people you disagree with. So there is very, contrary to what most people believe, there is less, but the political polarization has remained more or less the same, but what is seen is more affective polarization. And of course that affective polarization
easily translates into particular behavior that you could define as discrimination. So our guesses are either, there is a big difference between willingness to discriminate and discrimination as those things there is. That's one explanation, and either these experiments or the surveys are unreliable. The other hypothesis is that something has changed over the last 15 years, meaning that there is way more willingness to discriminate now than there was at the time when these CV studies were done. There are also some methodological issues with the CV study that I do touch upon in the book, but of course the same can be said about even our survey, about the survey, so I won't go into that. Okay.
Thanks, Andreas. Let's thank our speaker.